No one in Dry Creek could remember hearing the young woman's voice. Not when she bought flour from the general store, not when children accidentally bumped into her in the dusty street. Not even when the church ladies offered her fresh bread every Sunday. She simply answered with a gentle nod, a grateful smile, or a small note written in careful handwriting. Some people called her proud, others believed she had lost her mind. A few whispered darker stories that she had seen something terrible before arriving in town, something so frightening it had stolen her words forever. Only one thing was certain. Every Thursday morning, just after sunrise, she appeared in the center of town carrying a basket of freshly washed linens. She traded them for food, candles, and sewing thread before quietly disappearing toward the little cabin beyond Cottonwood Creek. No one followed, no one asked again. Until the day the blacksmith noticed something everyone else had missed. The bell above the blacksmith's shop rang softly as another customer left. Elias Turner wiped soot from his hands with an old leather rag before setting another horseshoe into the fire. Sparks leaped into the air while the forge roared like a living creature. He had spent 20 years listening more than talking. People often revealed themselves without realizing it. That morning he watched the silent woman crossing the street. Her basket looked unusually light, yet her shoulders sagged as though she carried something far heavier than laundry. She paused outside the bakery. She looked toward the warm loaves resting inside the window. Then she quietly counted a few coins in her hand. After a long moment, she closed her fingers around them and walked away without buying anything. Elias frowned. Minutes later, she entered the general store. When she came out, she carried lamp oil, needles, thread, and a small sack of beans. Still no bread. He returned to his anvil, but something about that choice lingered in his thoughts. A person could survive another night without fresh bread, but they rarely chose needles over food unless someone else depended on those needles. Later that afternoon, Elias delivered repaired wagon wheels to the schoolhouse. On his return, he noticed something odd. Fresh wagon tracks led away from town toward Cottonwood Creek. Only one pair of footprints returned. He stopped beside the trail. The second set had vanished near the cabin. Curious, he continued walking. The little house stood surrounded by wildflowers that had somehow survived the summer heat. Smoke curled gently from its chimney. Nothing seemed unusual until laughter drifted through an open window. Children, at least 3, Elias blinked. No one in town had mentioned children living there. He stepped back immediately. Whatever mystery lived inside that cabin wasn't his business. Or so he told himself. That evening, while shoeing Sheriff Dawson's horse, Elias asked casually, "Who owns the old cabin beyond Cottonwood Creek?" The sheriff shrugged. "Belonged to an old trapper years ago, and the woman living there, name's Clara according to church records. Family, no husband, no children." The sheriff looked puzzled. "Not that I know of." Elias said nothing more, but the laughter he had heard echoed in his mind. The following Thursday arrived with heavy clouds gathering across the plains. Clara appeared again exactly on schedule. Same faded blue dress, same woven basket, same quiet smile. Only this time Elias stepped into the street before she reached the general store. She stopped several feet away. For a long second they simply looked at one another. Her gray eyes carried exhaustion far older than her face. He tipped his hat. "Morning," she nodded politely. "I've been meaning to introduce myself." Another nod. "I'm Elias." She reached into her basket, removed a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. The handwriting was neat. "Thank you." "I know who you are," he smiled. "You know me." She nodded again. "Everyone knows the blacksmith." That almost made him laugh. "I suppose that's fair." She waited patiently. He realized she expected the conversation to end there. Instead, he asked gently, "Would you mind if I walked with you?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She hesitated, then finally nodded. Together they crossed the muddy street. People watched from porches and shop windows. Some exchanged surprised glances. No one had ever seen anyone simply walking beside Clara. Inside the general store, Mr. Holloway greeted them warmly. "Morning, Miss Clara," she smiled, then quietly handed over another list. Beans, flour, soap, bandages, tea leaves, again, no bread. No meat, no sugar, nothing for herself. Elias pretended to examine horse tack while secretly watching. When Mr. Holloway totaled the bill, Clara carefully removed every coin from a tiny cloth purse. She came up short only by a few cents. She immediately crossed 2 items off the list: tea leaves, then soap. Mr. Holloway looked uncomfortable. "I can put those aside for next week." She smiled thankfully, then gathered her supplies. Before she reached the door, Elias quietly placed 2 coins on the counter. "For the tea, Mr. Holloway." glanced toward Clara. She had already turned away. Without a word, he slipped the tea into her sack. Outside, Clara noticed the extra package almost immediately. She stopped walking. Her eyes moved from the tea to Elias. She understood. Slowly, she shook her head, then handed him another note. "Please don't." Elias read it twice. "Everyone needs tea." She took the paper back. "Wrote again, not when someone else paid." He studied her face. There was dignity there, not pride, not stubbornness, something deeper, the kind that survives hardship only by refusing charity. He nodded. "Then next time, you can repay me." She looked uncertain. Finally, a tiny smile appeared, the first real smile he had seen. She tucked the tea safely into her basket. Rain began before noon. The roads turned slick. Most townsfolk hurried indoors. Elias remained inside the forge repairing harness buckles. Near sunset, he heard frantic knocking. The church pastor stood outside, completely soaked. "Elias, what happened?" "Bridge washed out." "Anyone hurt?" "Stagecoach got through before it collapsed, but Miss Clara was trying to cross on foot." Elias dropped his hammer. "Is she injured?" "We couldn't find her." Without another question, he grabbed a lantern and mounted his horse. The creek had transformed into a roaring river. Broken pieces of the wooden bridge rushed downstream. Several townsmen searched the muddy banks. "Clara!" someone shouted into the rain. No answer. Elias scanned the darkness. Then he noticed something caught beneath a fallen cottonwood tree. A basket, its contents scattered across wet rocks. Flour, beans, tea, bandages. His stomach tightened. He climbed down the slippery bank. Nearby, he found fresh footprints leading away from the river instead of into it. Someone had survived. He followed the trail through heavy rain until the tracks disappeared beneath thick pine needles. Just as disappointment began settling in, a faint light flickered between the trees. It wasn't the town, it wasn't the church. It came from an old hunting cabin hidden deep in the woods. Elias approached slowly. Before he could knock, he heard Clara's voice, soft, urgent. Filled with fear, "Please, don't let them know we're here." The words froze him in place, not because she had spoken, but because someone inside answered. "Will the bad men find us again?" Elias realized in that single moment that the silence the town had judged for months had never been the real mystery. The real mystery was who Clara had been protecting all along. Rain drummed steadily against the weathered roof of the hunting cabin. Elias stood beneath the porch, every instinct telling him to knock, yet something held him back. Inside, Clara spoke again, her voice barely louder than the storm. "No, not tonight." "No one followed us." There was a pause, then a little girl's trembling voice asked, "You promise?" "I promise." The fear in those few words sounded too real to belong to a game. Elias stepped onto the porch and knocked gently. Silence. He heard hurried footsteps. Something heavy slid across the floor as though furniture had been pushed against the door. "Elias Turner," he called calmly. "The blacksmith." No answer. "I'm not here to force my way inside." Still nothing. "I found your basket near the creek." Several seconds passed before the door opened only a few inches. Clara stood there holding an old lantern. Her dress was soaked, her hair clung to her face, and mud covered the hem of her skirt. Behind her, 3 children huddled together, 2 girls, 1 boy, none older than 10. Each watched him with the wary eyes of children who had learned not to trust strangers. Clara looked from Elias to the darkness behind him, making certain he had come alone. Only then did she open the door. The cabin was far different from the one near Cottonwood Creek. This place had clearly been abandoned years ago. Rain leaked through cracks in the roof. A fire struggled inside a cracked stone fireplace. Blankets had been stitched together to keep the wind out. The children shared 1 bowl of vegetable stew. No one complained. No one reached for more than their share. Elias quietly set the recovered bag of tea and the few dry supplies he had managed to save onto the table. The youngest girl smiled for the first time. The tea, her older sister quickly placed a finger over her lips. The little girl immediately became quiet again. Clara looked embarrassed. She reached for a notebook lying beside the fireplace. After writing a few lines, she handed it to Elias. "Thank you for bringing these." He looked at the children. "They're your family." She slowly shook her head. The answer surprised him. He waited. She wrote again, "They're all that's left of another family." Elias looked at the three children more carefully. The oldest girl had freckles. The younger one had dark curls. The boy's hair was nearly white blonde. They looked nothing alike. He understood. These children had not been born into the same home. Life had brought them together. The oldest girl finally spoke. "My name's Emma." She couldn't have been older than 11, but she sat with the protective posture of an adult. "I'm Jacob," the boy said quietly. The little girl smiled shyly. "I'm Rose." Clara gently squeezed Rose's shoulder before writing another note. "They've been through enough." Elias nodded. "I won't ask questions they don't want to answer." The children relaxed just a little. Jacob studied Elias for a long moment before asking, "Are you going to tell everyone where we are?" The question carried no anger, only fear. Elias answered honestly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to tell them yet." Clara lowered her eyes. She seemed to expect that answer. When the storm eased an hour later, Elias prepared to leave. Before opening the door, Clara handed him another folded note. "Please, only one word, nothing else." He looked up. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for food. She was asking him to keep their secret. It was a heavy request, one that deserved the truth. "I won't betray you," he said quietly, "but if someone's hunting these children." She looked away. "Then eventually someone else will come." For the first time since he had met her, Clara didn't reach for her notebook. Instead, she whispered, "I know." The words were rough, as though her voice had gone unused for years. "I've just needed a little more time." The next morning, Dry Creek buzzed with rumors. Some believed Clara had nearly drowned. Others claimed she had disappeared into the mountains. Sheriff Dawson stopped by the forge before noon. "You searched longer than anyone." Elias nodded. "Find anything?" "Just her trail, and it led away from the river." The sheriff smiled with relief. "So she's alive." "Looks that way." Dawson leaned against the workbench. "When you see her again, tell her folks have been worried." Elias studied the sheriff's face. There wasn't a trace of suspicion, only genuine concern. That eased his mind at least a little. For the next several days, Elias found reasons to ride past the old hunting cabin. He never arrived empty-handed. One day he left fresh apples. Another day he repaired the cabin's broken chimney without saying a word. Later he quietly fixed the loose front steps while the children watched from the window. He never asked to come inside. Slowly, trust began replacing fear. The children even greeted him with cautious waves. Only Clara remained guarded, not unfriendly, just constantly alert, as though danger could appear at any moment. One afternoon, Jacob wandered outside while Elias repaired a broken fence nearby. "Can I help?" Elias smiled. "You ever hold a hammer?" Jacob nodded proudly. "Miss Clara taught me." For the next hour they worked side by side. Jacob asked endless questions. "How hot does iron get? Can anyone become a blacksmith? Have you ever made a sheriff's badge?" Elias laughed. "No, that's a jeweler's work." Jacob grinned. "I'd still rather make horseshoes." When they finished, Jacob admired the repaired fence. "It feels good." "What does?" "Fixing something." Elias looked at the boy. "You've fixed things before." Jacob nodded. "Mostly broken chairs and people when they're sad." The words caught Elias off guard. "Miss Clara says people break where nobody can see." Elias looked toward the cabin. Clara stood in the doorway watching them. She quickly looked away when their eyes met. Days turned into weeks. The children slowly became healthier. Emma laughed more often. Rose began picking wildflowers again. Jacob's shoulders lost their constant tension, yet Clara herself seemed to grow more exhausted. She slept little. She checked every trail before sunset. She listened whenever horses passed in the distance. One evening Elias finally asked, "How long have you been running?" She froze. Then quietly answered, "Almost 2 years." It was the longest sentence he had ever heard her speak. He waited. She continued, her voice uneven. "Not from the law?" "I didn't think so." From someone with money. Those words worried him more than if she had said outlaws. Men with money could hire others to do their searching. A week later, trouble arrived. A polished stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek carrying two well-dressed strangers. They weren't ranchers, they weren't traders, their boots were too clean. Their horses too expensive. One introduced himself at the sheriff's office as Mr. Edwin Mercer. The other never removed his gloves despite the summer heat. Within an hour, they had visited nearly every business in town. At sunset, they entered Elias' forge. Mercer unfolded a small drawing. It wasn't perfect, but the likeness was unmistakable. "It was Clara. We're searching for this woman," Mercer said pleasantly. "She's believed to have stolen something very valuable." Elias kept his face calm. "What sort of thing?" Mercer's smile never reached his eyes. "Our employer's property." "And what property is that?" the gloved man answered before Mercer could. "3 children." The forge suddenly felt much colder despite the blazing fire. Elias slowly set his hammer down. Mercer continued in a practiced, polite voice. "The woman has convinced the children that she's protecting them." He slid a leather pouch across the workbench. Gold coins clinked together. "That's only the beginning of the reward." Elias didn't even glance at the money. Instead, he asked the question that had been growing in his mind for weeks. "If they belong to your employer, why are they so afraid of being found?" For the first time, Mercer's smile disappeared. The gloved man stepped forward. "Fear can be taught." Elias held his gaze. "So can kindness." Neither man replied. After a long silence, Mercer picked up the pouch of gold. "If you happen to remember seeing her, send word." The two strangers left. Elias watched them disappear into the evening dust. Then he looked toward the distant hills where the hidden cabins stood. He finally understood. Clara hadn't been hiding because she was guilty. She had been hiding because someone powerful wanted those children back, and they would rather face hunger, storms, and lonely cabins than return. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the church bell rang the hour. Elias untied his horse without wasting another second. He knew he had to reach Clara before the strangers did. The sun was already slipping behind the hills when Elias urged his horse toward the hidden cabin. The trail was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. He replayed every word Mercer had spoken. Fear can be taught. No, not the fear he had seen in those children. That kind of fear settled into a person's bones. It wasn't imagined, it had been earned. By the time Elias reached the cabin, smoke no longer rose from the chimney. His heart tightened. He dismounted and hurried to the porch. The door stood open. Inside, the room was empty. The blankets were gone. The lantern was missing. Only a folded note rested on the table. It was written in Clara's careful hand. "I couldn't risk bringing danger to Dry Creek. Thank you for showing us that good people still exist. Please don't follow." Elias folded the paper slowly. Then he smiled to himself. "You've known me long enough to know I won't listen to that." The tracks were fresh, 4 sets of footprints, 1 adult, 3 children. They headed north toward the old canyon trail where abandoned mining camps dotted the hills. It was difficult country, rocky, steep, easy to disappear in. It was also easy to become trapped. Elias followed until darkness made the trail impossible to read. He camped beside a small stream, rising before dawn to continue. By mid-morning, he found something else: horse tracks, 2 riders. They had crossed the children's path less than an hour earlier. Mercer had found the trail. Elias kicked his horse into a gallop. At the same time, Clara led the children through a narrow canyon. Emma noticed the riders first. "They're behind us." Jacob turned pale. Rose clutched Clara's hand so tightly her tiny fingers trembled. "There," Clara said, pointing toward an abandoned silver mine. "If we can reach it, they'll have to leave their horses." The children ran. Loose stones rolled beneath their boots. The canyon echoed with hoofbeats growing louder every minute. Mercer's voice carried through the rocks. "Stop running, no one will be harmed." Emma whispered. "He's lying." Clara didn't answer, she simply kept running. The entrance to the mine appeared just ahead. Dark, cold, silent, they slipped inside moments before Mercer and the gloved man reached the opening. "Come out," Mercer called. "You've frightened these children long enough." His voice sounded calm, reasonable, almost kind, but Clara had heard that tone before, years earlier, before she had learned what hid behind it. She gathered the children behind an old timber support. "No matter what you hear," she whispered, "stay together." Jacob nodded bravely. Emma wrapped an arm around Rose. Outside, the men dismounted. Boots crunched over loose gravel, then silence, too much silence. A loud crack echoed through the canyon, not a gunshot, a hammer striking stone. The gloved man was knocking away the old wooden supports near the mine entrance. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Emma looked up. "They're trying to collapse it." Clara realized he was right. If the entrance caved in, they would be trapped. She searched desperately for another way out. Then Jacob pointed toward a narrow passage. "I felt cold air. There had to be another opening." "Go," Clara whispered. "Don't stop." The children disappeared into the darkness. Clara remained behind. She grabbed an old lantern lying near the wall and swung it hard against a stack of rotten crates. The glass shattered. Oil spread across the floor. One spark from a fallen ember, whoosh. Flames raced across the dry wood. Smoke filled the entrance. Mercer stumbled backward. "What is she doing?" The fire didn't grow large enough to endanger the children, but it forced the two men away from the collapsing supports. It bought precious minutes, exactly what Clara needed. Meanwhile, Elias reached the canyon. Smoke curled into the sky. He heard shouting, then the frightened whinny of horses. He ran toward the mine. Mercer turned just as Elias arrived. "Stay out of this!" Elias didn't slow. He drove his shoulder into the gloved man, knocking him to the ground. Mercer swung a fist. Elias blocked it with his forearm. Years of swinging heavy hammers had made him stronger than he looked. The fight was short but fierce. Mercer reached for a revolver. Before he could draw it, another voice thundered across the canyon. "Drop it!" Sheriff Dawson stood on the ridge above with 3 deputies. The revolver fell into the dirt. Mercer slowly raised his hands. The gloved man tried to run. He didn't make it 10 steps before a deputy tackled him. Inside the mine, Clara finally caught up with the children. The narrow passage opened onto the far side of the hill. Fresh mountain air poured through the opening. They were safe, almost. "Elias!" Jacob shouted. Clara turned. Elias emerged from the passage covered in soot. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rose ran forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You found us," he smiled through the dust. "I said I would." Clara lowered her head. "I told you not to follow, I know. I'm glad you ignored me." For the first time, they both laughed. It was quiet, tired, but real. Over the following days, the truth spread through Dry Creek. Mercer's employer wasn't a loving guardian. He operated several remote labor camps disguised as orphan homes. Children without families were forced to work long hours under cruel overseers. Those who tried to escape were hunted down. Emma, Jacob, and Rose had escaped during a wagon transfer nearly 2 years earlier. Clara had stumbled upon them hiding beside an abandoned creek bed. She had learned the truth little by little. Instead of turning them over, she had walked away from her own life to protect them. She moved from town to town, worked wherever she could. Spoke as little as possible, not because she couldn't speak, but because every unnecessary conversation risked revealing the children's whereabouts. Silence had become her shield. Weeks later, officials from the territorial court arrived. After gathering testimony from Sheriff Dawson, Pastor Lewis, Elias, and several neighboring towns, Mercer's employer was arrested. The labor camps were closed. Dozens of children were rescued. For the first time in years, Emma, Jacob, and Rose slept without fear of waking to footsteps outside their door. Life slowly returned to normal, though normal looked different now. The old cabin near Cottonwood Creek was repaired by nearly every family in Dry Creek. Mr. Holloway refused to charge Clara for flour during the first month. The church ladies brought quilts not out of pity but as neighbors. Children who had once stared at Clara from a distance now ran to greet her, and every Thursday morning she still walked into town with her basket, only now she stopped to chat just a little. One afternoon, Rose tugged on Clara's sleeve outside the blacksmith shop. "You forgot something? What? You didn't say goodbye." Clara smiled and looked toward Elias, who was shaping a glowing piece of iron on his anvil. She walked over. "Thank you," she said aloud. Her voice was still soft from years of silence, but it no longer trembled. Elias rested his hammer. You don't have to thank me, I do, for believing me before you even knew my story. He shook his head gently. I believed what I saw, and what was that? A woman who skipped buying bread so 3 children wouldn't go without bandages. Clara laughed, wiping away a tear. I thought no one noticed. I've spent my whole life noticing things. She looked around the busy little town. Children chased each other through the street. The church bell rang in the distance. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, none of it felt unfamiliar. It felt like home. Months later, the town held its annual harvest gathering. As music filled the square, Pastor Lewis stood to thank the volunteers who had helped rebuild homes, repair fences, and care for the rescued children. Before ending his speech, he smiled toward Clara. There was a time, he said, when we believed kindness always arrived with loud words and grand gestures. He paused. This town learned something different. Sometimes the bravest soul is the one who carries the heaviest burden in complete silence. The crowd applauded. Clara lowered her head, embarrassed by the attention. Elias caught her eye from across the square. He simply tipped his hat. She smiled back, not with the guarded smile of a stranger passing through, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found people she no longer had to hide from. And in Dry Creek, where everyone once wondered why the silent woman never spoke to anyone in town, they eventually discovered that her silence had never been empty. It had been filled with courage, sacrifice, and a promise to 3 frightened children that she refused to break. When she finally found a place where that promise no longer required silence, her voice returned, not because the pain had been forgotten, but because hope had finally become stronger than fear. And in the years that followed, whenever newcomers asked about the woman who often visited the blacksmith's shop with 3 laughing children close behind, the people of Dry Creek always gave the same answer. She taught us that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that waits until it's finally safe to be heard.